Waiter ignores elderly black woman. Shock when her son reveals her true identity that leaves everyone speechless. What happens when a simple mistake leads to an unexpected revelation that changes everything? When a young waiter dismisses an elderly black woman, he has no idea that his actions will set off a chain of events that not only reveals her true identity, but also forces him to confront his own flaws. Get ready for a powerful story of redemption, second chances, and the shocking truths that lie beneath the surface. If you've ever wondered how the choices we make shape our futures, don't miss this story. Dive into the unexpected twists and emotional transformations that will leave you questioning your own path. Share this story with others who believe in the power of change, and join the conversation in the comments. How far would you go to make things right? The cozy glow of warm chandeliers reflected off the polished floors of Le Chateau Noir, one of Manhattan's most exclusive fine dining establishments. Nestled in the heart of the Upper East Side, the restaurant was a known haven for the city's elite. Celebrities, CEOs, and dignitaries who sought privacy, indulgence, and a taste of prestige along with their meals. Tonight was no exception. The tables were adorned with crisp white linens, fine silverware gleamed under the golden light, and the air was rich with the scent of seared filet mignon, truffle risotto, and aged Bordeaux. Among the sea of well-dressed patrons, a small, elderly black woman entered the restaurant with slow, deliberate steps. She wore a modest yet elegant navy blue dress with pearl buttons, a thick wool coat draped over her shoulders despite the controlled warmth inside. Her gray hair was neatly styled, and her warm brown eyes surveyed the room with quiet observance. She carried herself with an air of grace, her back straight despite her years, her hands clasped around the handle of an old leather handbag that had seen better days. Behind her walked a tall man in his early 40s, his presence commanding. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that fit him perfectly, exuding confidence and quiet power. His skin was a rich mahogany, his sharp features symmetrical and striking. A Rolex glinted subtly on his wrist, and his polished shoes made not a single sound on the marble floors. The maitre d', a wiry man in his 50s with slick-back silver hair, immediately recognized him. His face went stiff with polite deference. "Mr. Carter," the maitre d' said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Welcome back to Le Chateau Noir. Always a pleasure to have you." The man, James Carter, nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Table for two, please." The maitre d' nodded, turning sharply to one of the waiting staff. "Jacob, seat Mr. Carter and his guest at one of our private tables." A young waiter, no older than 25, stepped forward. He was tall and lanky, with neatly combed blonde hair and an air of self-importance. His name tag read Jacob Whitmore, and he wore an expression that barely masked his impatience. With a tight-lipped smile, he grabbed 2 menus and gestured lazily. "Right this way," Jacob said, not sparing a glance at the elderly woman accompanying James. As they followed, James's mother, Margaret Carter, moved with steady purpose, though the years weighed on her steps. She took in the restaurant's ambience with mild amusement. It was the kind of place where people judged you by your shoes, your watch, your surname. She had seen it all before. Jacob led them to a corner booth, one of the less prominent tables, closer to the entrance and away from the VIP section. He set the menus down without much care, stepping back as though eager to be elsewhere. James glanced around before raising an eyebrow. "This isn't one of your private tables." Jacob shrugged. "It's what we have available at the moment." The dismissiveness in his voice was slight, but noticeable. His gaze lingered on Margaret for a fraction of a second before flicking back to James. There was something subtle in his expression, a quiet condescension. James didn't react, but Margaret noticed. She always noticed. "How considerate of you," she murmured, her voice soft yet unmistakably firm. Jacob's lips twitched, but before he could respond, he was called away by another patron snapping their fingers impatiently. James exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Some things never change." Margaret smiled gently as she removed her coat and set it beside her. "No, they don't." She had experienced far worse in her lifetime. Back when hotels, restaurants, and even sidewalks weren't so welcoming to someone who looked like her. This, this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Still, James's jaw was tight. He had built his life in a world that judged people by the weight of their last names, the numbers in their accounts, the power they held. And yet, here they were. A few minutes passed before Jacob returned. His tone was clipped as he asked, "Are you ready to order?" Margaret glanced up at him, tilting her head. "Could we have some water first?" Jacob gave a short nod but didn't move right away. Instead, he turned to James. "Would you like still or sparkling?" Margaret, still waiting for an acknowledgement, pressed her lips together before speaking again. "I'll take some as well, dear." Jacob didn't respond, instead shifting his weight. James's expression darkened just slightly. Jacob finally jotted something down before walking off without another word. Margaret let out a small chuckle once he was out of earshot. "Bless his heart," she said, amusement dancing in her eyes. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You shouldn't have to deal with this, Ma." Margaret reached across, patting his hand lightly. "It's fine, James. I'm too old to let a boy with too much hair gel and not enough manners ruin my evening." James, though still simmering, chuckled at that. His mother had always been like this, graceful in the face of disrespect, unshaken by small minds. Across the room, Jacob stood by the bar, whispering something to another waiter. They both glanced back at the table, smirking before returning to their tasks. Margaret noticed. So did James. It was a moment, small, insignificant to anyone who had never felt the weight of unspoken judgment. But James knew, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Margaret, however, already had a sense of what was coming. She had seen it before, the way people underestimated her. She had spent a lifetime proving them wrong. But tonight, it wouldn't be her who spoke. It would be her son. And when he did, the entire restaurant, Jacob included, would never forget it. Margaret Carter sat with quiet dignity, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her water glass. The air around her hummed with the gentle clinking of silverware and murmured conversations. But there was an undercurrent of something else, an unspoken tension that simmered just beneath the surface. James leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes following Jacob as he moved through the restaurant. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed such treatment, but it never failed to stir something deep within him. He had spent years building a name for himself, ensuring that doors once closed to people like him were forced open. And yet, here he was, watching his mother, a woman who had faced and conquered far greater obstacles, be dismissed as though she were invisible. Margaret, on the other hand, remained unbothered, her expression unreadable. "You're thinking too hard, James," she said softly, a knowing smile playing on her lips. James exhaled, shaking his head. "I just don't like it." Margaret chuckled. "You never did." She reached for the menu, her fingers brushing against the fine leather cover. "You know, there was a time when a place like this wouldn't have let me through the front door," she mused. "And if they did, they'd have sat me in the back by the kitchen, if they let me sit at all." James clenched his jaw. "And now they just ignore you instead. Some progress." Margaret's smile didn't falter. "Progress isn't always loud, son. Sometimes it's a whisper." James studied his mother, a deep respect settling over him. She had lived through more than he could fathom. Marches, protests, courtrooms filled with people who didn't believe she belonged. And yet, she had carved her own path, not with anger, but with quiet, unwavering determination. "You know who you remind me of?" Margaret continued, setting the menu down. James arched an eyebrow. "Who?" "Your father." James's expression softened. "Dad wouldn't have let this slide either." Margaret laughed, the sound warm and full of memory. "No, he wouldn't have. But he also knew when to let people show themselves for who they really were." James glanced back at Jacob, who was chatting idly with another waiter, making no effort to return to their table. his fists clenched under the table. Well, this guy's making it real easy. Before Margaret could respond, another waiter approached their table. Unlike Jacob, this man appeared older, more experienced. His dark eyes flicked between them, his demeanor far more professional. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "My name is Anthony, and I'll be taking care of you from here on out. My sincerest apologies for any delay." Margaret's smile was warm but knowing. "Thank you, Anthony. We appreciate it." Anthony inclined his head, taking their drink orders and offering recommendations with ease. James watched him carefully, noting the subtle way he navigated the interaction, as if making up for his colleague's behavior, without explicitly acknowledging it. As Anthony walked away, James shook his head. "They know." Margaret took a sip of water. "Of course they do." She glanced toward Jacob, who had noticed Anthony taking over and was now whispering to another waiter, his expression tight. Margaret sighed. Poor thing doesn't even realize what he's doing to himself. James frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret set her glass down, her fingers interlocking. "People like him, James, they think they're making a statement, that they have the power to decide who matters and who doesn't. But the real power," she gestured subtly around the restaurant, "it's in how people remember you. And right now, that boy is writing himself into a story he won't like." James smirked. "He has no idea who you are, does he?" Margaret chuckled. "Not a clue?" James leaned forward, an amused glint in his eyes. "Want to see how long it takes before he figures it out." Margaret's smile widened. Now that, son, could be interesting. Meanwhile, across the restaurant, Jacob's irritation was mounting. He had seen Anthony take over the table, and something about it gnawed at him. It wasn't just that he had been replaced. It was why the older woman, despite her polished appearance, didn't belong in a place like this. She wasn't the type of customer that usually sat in the VIP section, and yet Anthony had stepped in as if they were important. Jacob scoffed, turning to his colleague, Mason. "I don't get it. Why would Anthony bother?" Mason, a more seasoned waiter, shot him a look. "Maybe because it's his job." Jacob rolled his eyes. "Come on. You saw them. The guy, sure, he looks like money. But the old lady," he scoffed, "probably a family visit. Someone like her wouldn't be able to afford a place like this." Mason frowned. "I don't know, man. Something about that guy felt familiar. You sure you know who he is?" Jacob shrugged. "Some hedge fund guy, probably. Wall Street is crawling with them." Mason didn't look convinced. "I'd be careful, man. I've worked here long enough to know that the people who get ignored are usually the ones who can buy the whole damn restaurant." Jacob huffed. "Yeah, right." But doubt had begun to creep in. Margaret watched as Jacob grew more unsettled. She had seen it happen many times before. The moment when people began to realize they had misjudged the situation entirely. "Son," she said softly, "have you ever noticed how people reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching?" James smirked. "Oh, I've noticed." Margaret tapped a manicured finger on the table. "And what do we do when that happens?" James's smile grew. "We let them find out the hard way." Just then, Anthony returned with their appetizers, moving with seamless professionalism. "Everything prepared to your liking?" Margaret nodded. "Perfectly. Thank you." Anthony hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking again. "If I may, Mrs. Carter, it is truly an honor to serve you tonight." Jacob, who had been passing by at that exact moment, stopped mid-step. His head snapped toward the table, his expression shifting from indifference to confusion. "Mrs. Carter?" Something about the name tickled the edge of his memory. But before he could place it, James leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Something wrong, Jacob?" James asked smoothly. Jacob swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of the room shift. Margaret simply smiled, her eyes twinkling. The night was far from over, and soon everyone in that restaurant would know exactly who she was. Jacob felt a strange tightness in his chest as he stood frozen near the bar, replaying Anthony's words in his head. Mrs. Carter. The name sounded important, yet he couldn't quite place it. His gaze flicked back to the table, where the elderly woman sipped her water with effortless grace. Something about her suddenly felt different, though nothing had physically changed. James Carter, on the other hand, had been watching Jacob closely, his expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, James was calculating. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating billion-dollar deals, and he knew when someone had backed themselves into a corner. And Jacob had done exactly that. Margaret, ever observant, leaned forward slightly and spoke in a soft voice only her son could hear. Let him stew a little longer. James smirked. I plan to... Across the restaurant, Mason, the more experienced waiter, nudged Jacob's arm. You good, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. Jacob snapped out of his daze. Yeah, I'm fine. Just... Who do you think that old lady is? Mason frowned. You really don't know? Jacob shook his head. Mason exhaled sharply. Damn, man. You might have just messed up real bad. Jacob's stomach churned. Why, who is she? Mason leaned in, lowering his voice. I don't know the full story, but I know she's somebody. I heard the owner mention her once. Said if she ever came in, we should treat her like royalty. Jacob's throat went dry. You're messing with me? Mason shook his head. Nope. And if Anthony recognized her by name, that means you're in trouble, man. You better hope she doesn't complain. Jacob felt a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. He had ignored and dismissed people before. It was part of working in an upscale restaurant where certain guests were deemed more important than others. But something about this was different. Still, he forced himself to shrug. Even if she's someone important, what's the worst that can happen? It's not like she owns a place. Mason gave him a long, unimpressed look. You sure about that? Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Back at the table, Margaret and James were enjoying their meal at a leisurely pace, though James occasionally glanced toward Jacob, watching the young man squirm. Margaret, ever composed, dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin before speaking. You always did enjoy watching people realize their mistakes, she mused. James smirked. It's entertaining. Margaret chuckled. True, but I never taught you to be cruel, James. His smile faded slightly. I'm not being cruel. I just don't like when people underestimate you. Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. Son, people have underestimated me my entire life. If I let every slight get under my skin, I'd have never made it past my 20s. James exhaled, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. I know, Ma, but this is different. He looked right through you like you didn't even exist. Margaret tilted her head slightly, observing her son. And you think making him uncomfortable will change that? James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Jacob, who was now fidgeting behind the bar, clearly distressed. He had seen men like Jacob before. People who believed power was about appearance, who thought wealth was limited to those who looked a certain way, acted a certain way. Margaret sighed, sensing her son's lingering frustration. You want to teach him a lesson, don't you? James finally looked back at her, a smirk returning. I don't have to. He's teaching himself one right now. Margaret laughed softly. You really are your father's son. An unexpected interruption, just as James was about to respond. A voice broke through the low hum of restaurant chatter. Excuse me, Mrs. Carter? James and Margaret turned toward the voice, and Jacob, who had been eavesdropping nearby, stiffened immediately. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, approached the table with a warm yet deeply respectful expression. His salt and pepper hair was neatly styled, and there was an undeniable authority in the way he carried himself. Margaret's eyes twinkled with recognition. Richard, dear, what a pleasant surprise. The man, Richard Lawson, owner of Le Chateau Noir, extended his hand, which Margaret took graciously. "My goodness, it's been too long," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "What an honor to have you dining with us tonight." Jacob's heart nearly stopped. The owner knows her? James grinned, enjoying the moment far more than he should. "Good to see you, Richard." Richard turned to James, shaking his hand firmly. "Likewise, my friend. How's the firm treating you?" James chuckled. "Busy but good. We just closed the merger with the Danforth Group." Richard's eyes widened slightly. "Impressive. Not that I'm surprised. You've always had the sharpest mind in the room." Jacob felt like the walls were closing in around him. "Merger? Firm? Who exactly is this guy?" Richard turned his attention back to Margaret, his expression full of reverence. "Mrs. Carter, I hope everything has been to your satisfaction. If there's anything at all you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Margaret smiled warmly. "Everything has been lovely, dear. Though, I must say, we had a bit of an interesting start." Richard immediately stiffened, his eyes darkening. "Oh." James leaned back in his chair, casually gesturing toward Jacob. "Let's just say one of your waiters was a little selective with his service tonight." Jacob's stomach dropped. Richard followed James's gaze, his sharp eyes landing on Jacob with an expression that could have frozen fire. "Which waiter?" Richard asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Margaret, ever the gracious one, simply smiled. "Oh, let's not make a fuss, dear. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding." Richard, however, was already summoning the maitre d', his tone firm. "I want to know exactly what happened." Jacob felt the blood drain from his face. This was no longer just an awkward moment. This was turning into a disaster. The realization hits as the maitre d' hurried over. Jacob was finally putting the pieces together. James Carter. That name wasn't just familiar, it was significant. James Carter was one of the most powerful corporate lawyers in the country. His firm handled billion-dollar deals, and his name regularly appeared in financial magazines. And Mrs. Carter? Jacob's stomach turned. He had ignored and disrespected a woman who was not only someone of status, but someone deeply connected to the very people who owned the world he lived in. Panic set in. He had misjudged them. And now, he was about to face the consequences. Jacob's pulse thundered in his ears as Richard Lawson, the restaurant's owner, fixed him with an unblinking stare. The weight of his mistake settled like a stone in his gut. He had dismissed Margaret Carter, the Margaret Carter, without realizing who she was. And now, the consequences were unfolding before his eyes. The maitre d', a tall, immaculately dressed man named Charles, approached swiftly. His demeanor was professional, but Jacob could see the tension in his eyes. "Sir," Charles addressed Richard, glancing between him and Jacob, "is there an issue I should be aware of?" Richard's expression remained calm, but his tone carried a distinct edge. "It seems we had an incident of poor service this evening." His gaze flicked toward Jacob. "I'd like an explanation." Jacob opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. What could he say? That he had judged Margaret by her appearance? That he assumed she didn't belong? Any excuse would only make things worse. James, who had been silently watching the scene unfold, decided to push the moment further. "I'm actually curious myself," he said, his voice smooth but unmistakably sharp. "Maybe Jacob here can explain why he had time for every other table except ours." Jacob felt the unspoken accusation settle like a noose around his neck. He could feel the eyes of other waiters, and even some guests drifting toward the confrontation. I didn't mean," Jacob stammered. Margaret, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "Young man, tell me something," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "What did you see when you looked at me earlier?" Jacob's breath caught. The question hit him harder than he expected. Margaret's expression remained kind but expectant. "Go on, dear. Speak freely." Jacob swallowed hard. He wanted to deny everything, to say he hadn't thought anything at all. But Margaret's piercing gaze seemed to strip away any pretense. I just assumed, he hesitated, shame washing over him. I didn't think you were, a regular guest. James scoffed, shaking his head. You mean you didn't think she belonged here? Jacob's face burned. He had no defense. Richard sighed and turned to Margaret. Mrs. Carter, I want to personally apologize for this. This is not how we conduct business here. Margaret smiled graciously. I appreciate that, Richard. But let's not ruin the night over one young man's mistake. Richard's jaw tightened. I assure you, he won't be making that mistake again. He turned back to Jacob. We hold ourselves to a certain standard here. If you can't meet it, then this isn't the place for you. Jacob's heart pounded. Please, sir, it won't happen again. Before Richard could respond, Margaret held up a hand. Richard, dear, may I speak with Jacob alone for a moment? Everyone paused, surprised by the request, including Jacob himself. Richard hesitated before nodding. Of course. He gestured for the others to step away. Even James, who looked like he had more to say, respected his mother's wishes and leaned back in his chair, watching. Once they were alone, Margaret gestured to the empty chair across from her. Sit. Jacob hesitated before obeying, his hands clasped together tightly. Margaret studied him for a moment. Tell me, Jacob, how long have you worked here? About a year, he mumbled. And before that, other restaurants, a few hotels. Margaret nodded. And do you enjoy this job? Jacob hesitated, then sighed. It's a job. Margaret smiled slightly. A job that feeds you, pays your bills, gives you an opportunity. He nodded. She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Then tell me, why would you risk it by making assumptions about the people you serve? Jacob swallowed. I don't know. I just thought. He exhaled sharply. I just saw an old woman and thought she wasn't important. Margaret held his gaze. And now, Jacob's shame was evident. I was wrong. Margaret nodded. Yes, you were. But tell me, Jacob, will you be different next time? Jacob hesitated. I want to be. Margaret studied him for a long moment before nodding, then listened carefully. Jacob straightened, hanging on to her words. I've been where you are, Margaret said softly. Not as a waiter, but as someone people didn't believe in. I know what it feels like to be dismissed before you even open your mouth. And let me tell you, it's a heavy thing to carry. Jacob's brow furrowed, not expecting such honesty. But the real question, Margaret continued, is whether you'll be the kind of person who adds to that weight for others, or the kind who lifts it. Jacob looked down ashamed. I don't want to be that kind of person. Margaret reached into her purse, pulling out a business card. She slid it across the table. He hesitated before picking it up. His eyes widened as he read. Margaret Carter, founder and CEO. Carter Foundation. His breath caught. Carter Foundation? The nonprofit that had built schools, funded scholarships, and changed thousands of lives? Margaret smiled knowingly. Surprise? Jacob nodded numbly. Margaret stood, smoothing out her elegant blouse. I believe people can change, Jacob. But change isn't just words. It's action. If you truly want to do better, start by seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. Jacob clutched the card tightly, his mind racing. Margaret gave him one final, kind smile before turning back to James. Come, son. I believe it's time for dessert. As she walked away, Jacob remained seated, his hands trembling slightly. He had come to work expecting an ordinary night. Instead, he had been given a lesson he would never forget. Meanwhile, at the bar, Mason, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, whistled low. Man, you got lucky. Jacob exhaled sharply. Yeah, I did. Mason nudged his arm. So, you gonna keep that card or toss it? Jacob looked down at the card in his hand. He had no idea why Margaret had given it to him. But one thing was clear. This was an opportunity, a chance to be better, and for the first time that night, he felt something unexpected. Hope. Jacob sat in stunned silence, staring at the business card in his hands. His fingers traced the embossed lettering, Margaret Carter, founder and CEO, Carter Foundation. The weight of his mistake settled fully on him now, not just because of who she was, but because of what she represented. He had dismissed a woman who had spent her life uplifting others, a woman who had built an empire of generosity, while he had acted out of sheer prejudice and assumption. He wanted to believe his mistake had been harmless, just a simple oversight. But deep down, he knew better. Margaret Carter had given him something no lecture, punishment, or firing could have: the chance to reflect. The tension builds across the restaurant. James was still watching him, his sharp gaze unrelenting.